I think it's a fascinating story that we're all going to understand better over the next half hour or so. Let me introduce, first of all, to my left, your right, John Sullivan. He is CEO of Clinical Sports Consulting Services, which has to be the most anodyne title I've ever heard. It doesn't really tell us that he is one of the top sports psychologists in the US. His specialties include human performance technology, central nervous system measurement and assessment, concussion assessment and rehab. He's spent 16 years working with the NFL, providing sports science to many Super Bowl teams and other champions. He also consulted with the British Premier League football, which we all know is not really football, and the Premier League rugby. And perhaps more important for the conversation that we're about to have, Sullivan was a consultant to U.S. Special Forces, providing insight on welfare, recovery, cognitive abilities, and performance. He has distilled many of his insights into a book titled The Brain Always Wins, Improving Your Life Through Better Brain Management. And I'm sure we're going to talk about some of what's in that book also. But I want to start by introducing Jeff Nichols. Jeff Nichols is the kind of guy they build action movies around. He is an exercise physiologist with 2 times U, but what he brings to that is 11 years as a Navy SEAL. He volunteered not long after 9/11. It will be 15 years next month that Jeff Nichols joined the Navy. He became a Navy SEAL, was assigned to SEAL teams on both the East and West Coast, deployed all over the world, Asia, South America, Africa, the Middle East. And while a SEAL, he headed the active duty human performance department of the SEALs. He retired from the Navy in 2013. An Australian news site described him as having been blown up, stabbed, and shot. Now, some of these deployments he can't talk about, so maybe we won't hear those stories. But Jeff Nichols says that John Sullivan saved his life. And I'm not sure I really understand that, and I really hope that in the next 20 minutes or so I do. So, Jeff Nichols, let me ask you to start by telling us what was the shape you were in at your worst point in the midst of all these deployments?
I guess there's no real easy way to kind of deliver my state other than just the kind of the facts of it. At the point of my diagnosis, if you will, of like my traumatic brain injuries and so forth, I had 22 concussions that we were counting. I had 7 herniated discs. I still got a bullet in my arm. And just a bunch of other things that just comes with the job. So, in the irony, kind of the story has got to be, it's not really super straightforward, and really me meeting John. So, it's kind of a roundabout way to answer your question is that I was in a state that I was a very high performer physically and mentally, but I got to the point where my nervous system was failing. Like it really was giving me all these, the way I describe it is the check engine light on your car. It'll come on and we kind of think, well, the vehicle's operating fine. I can't really feel anything and we're gonna keep driving it, but at some point, if you don't get it serviced, it's gonna stop when you need it the most, and then you go, I had no idea, because the nervous system is the computer and it's just gonna shut down on you.
So your check engine light, when it went on, I read that your first step was to go to a local bookstore to try to get some answers?
Yeah, my check engine light was on for about 8 years. And so I had about 17 combat deployments, and I did it in the span of about 9 years. I averaged about 308 days gone a year in combat, and that was just my life. That's what I did. That's what I knew. I was very good at it.
And just remind us, you know much more than I do, but SEAL deployments don't tend to be super long.
They're not,
the individual
not
deployment.
Typically, right? Yeah, they average a certain length, and they're fairly short by nature. but the frequency is very high. And there's a reason for that. But for me, before I came into the Navy, I was a strength coach and an exercise physiologist in grad school and so forth, and I had a pretty good understanding when I thought of how the human body worked and so forth. And so, but being a high performer and being in a community where failure is a bad thing. You don't want to get there because your life depends on someone else, and all those sort of cliches. But I had all these, we'll call them issues. And for me to get 3 hours of sleep in a week was good. So
3 hours of sleep.
And I'd average, and so on a good week I might sleep 7 or 8 hours, but that was Ambien driven. Lunesta stopped working. I averaged about 70 milligrams of morphine a day. Fentanyl because of the pain. And so forth. So it got to the point where even the Nubain stopped working, and I was being prescribed heroin for my issues. But it just got to the point where I had a breaking point. Now, so to be very, very clear, like really clear, this was not the medical. I had really good medical care, but it just got to the point where they weren't doping me up to I put no blame on our military. It was on me to do that because I had to do that to do my job. I woke up, my coffee was morphine, okay? That's about every 3 or 4 hours I was taking 10 milligrams of morphine or Dilaudid or fentanyl. I was up to 40 Percocet a day, but I had to, and it won't go down to the graphic nature of how I didn't ingest them. Well, I put them in the other end. So I just got to a point where I was so tolerant of that sort of stress, I just thought it was like by proxy, that's what I did. This is for me to do the job, and if there was a movie about it, I was there, and that's the command I was at. So let me kind of bring this big aircraft carrier around, is that I was visiting John under a totally different reason. So
what was that reason?
So we were trying to validate a piece of technology called the CogniSense NeuroTracker. So we know John, I say we, the civilian counterpart at the command I was at, we had known John professionally that he was an individual using them in certain organizations for cognitive improvement. We thought that would be a great device to use in our population, so we visited him. And the person I was with, I trust. And so long or the short is, that person I was with said, you can trust this man, right? Trust for me is hard to come by, but for whatever reason, John and I were talking under just, he was interrogating me in some regard, and I was interrogating him in another regard. But he was asking me questions about, hey, how you've been sleeping, how have you been digesting food, all those sort of things. So unbeknownst to me about the physical connection to the vagus nerve and the gut biome and all those sort of things. And we started engaging about how to create a Pavlovian response. And in the context of what we were talking about, I have a 10-year-old son. At the time he was an infant, and my ex-wife used to rub Vicks VapoRub on his feet. I removed the end of his crib, and the very rare moments that I would see my son, it would be in the middle of the night. I'd come home and do laundry, and I'd be gone the next day. But I would get on my knees, and I'd lay in the edge of his bed, and I'd hold his feet. And I had this connection to eucalyptus, which was really, I didn't realize at the time, but it was the only thing in my life that I really, really loved. Like truly, it was the only thing that I cared about was my son, which still to this day exists. But those moments was the only thing in my mind that John brought out to me that mattered. And so he had said, hey, let's start working on some essential oils, specifically eucalyptus, and see if you can get that Pavlovian, like I'm paraphrasing, of course, but.
Hold that thought. I want to get a sense of John Sullivan's reaction as you got to know Jeff a little bit with all your other experience in sports medicine and as a consultant to U.S. Special Forces. Did what you were seeing here fit a pattern that you recognized? Was this
Yeah, and typically people would talk about the pattern from a clinical nature, from a clinical standpoint of, okay, there's disease, there's disorder, there's illness. And I don't look at it that way. If our brain is wired to be the most sophisticated survival system in the world, it's about looking for those strengths that accent normal pathways, quality of life, and get back to a place in which that person will decide, okay, these are normal activities, and they're actually making me, more resilient. And so that's why when he tells that story, it was really about, okay, I'm hearing, you're not sleeping. You haven't slept for months. We know sleep is the #1 performance enhancer. Nothing beats it. And if the brain doesn't detoxify at night, then all these other things that he's experiencing, the lower tolerance of pain, the ability to focus, the ability to feel, and not feel so numb, he's not broken. It's about we have to get things back to the resiliency that he had at a prior time. And he had all the strengths for that. So I look for strengths. And so when I was hearing that connection to his son, it was triggering a response to be able to be restful, to be sleep, to be parasympathetic, to be calm, to be recovered, to be relaxed, or to at least slow down. It was like, boom, there it is. We've got to focus on those things. Yet when most people seek this out, even when I'm working with elite athletes, as I said earlier in our talks, exercise that we all may do is neuroprotective. Sport is not, it's trauma. That's here. What Jeff does and all those who serve us is here. But it doesn't lose the fact that the brain is very resilient. So I'm looking for those resiliencies. But all the pathways, like everything he was talking about as signs and symptoms, those are completely normal. If you're going to experience stress and trauma at that level, you can expect there's going to be occurrences of symptoms and things that are also informative, yet we all immediately think those are signs of illness. Those information. How do I move towards resilience? And then sometimes it's information of pump the brakes. Like, okay, I'm going too far. So when I heard Jeff, it's like, this is normal. If you're going to be experiencing the things that Jeff has, or anyone in law enforcement, firefighter, the military, these are going to be normal reactions.
I'm not sure, I want to make sure I understand this in the context of the title of your book, The Brain Always Wins.
Yep.
If the brain always wins, how did Jeff get into such a bad state? Why didn't the brain correct for it? Why didn't the brain protect him?
Well, one of the things we often do is we muddy the waters. By not doing good assessments, we immediately go for interventions, not understanding, okay, one, have we taken any biologics, any bloods, any fecal matter, any EEG, any heart rate variability, to understand the functional state of the individual. I'm not saying medication can't be a reasonable intervention, but we're jumping to because he's so essential. Because there are very few people in the world that can do the job of elite military. So they're looking to patch as opposed to process them towards health, which is a process of day-to-day activities that build neuroresiliency. So when you add medication, you lose some of the signaling that is natural to return us back to getting engaged into things that allow us, like your names, like sleep, like hydration, not eating high glycemic food that damages the gut biota so neurotransmitters don't get to the brain. And so when we address things, we're not often doing it in a process, we're doing it as a solution as opposed to engaging a process that we all have. Modern technology damages it for all of us. 4 people invented the smartphone, the iPhone. 2 of them were trained in neurofeedback. How do we get this light to create addiction? And that changes our sleep schedules, endocrine function, hunger cycles. And so we have to think about the brain gives us signals that sometimes our modern life or even medicine disrupts. And then we don't know what they are. Gut instincts are real, but we ignore them.
So, Jeff, pick up the story. You were talking about you and John worked on a way for you to essentially use the reaction you got to a particular scent, eucalyptus,
Right.
to somehow build on that.
Yeah, I think one of the really difficult things with our military and law enforcement, and that's what I pretty much do full time, is work with. As an exercise physiologist, I work in conjunction with folks like John to tackle this idea, and it's, oftentimes people don't know where to start. And I think that's what it became for me. I finally had a starting point. Number one, I had another piece where somebody was actually, one of the things I was taught in my community is if you have a problem, come with a solution, or don't bother, come with a problem at all. Finally, someone gave me a solution. They gave me a clear idea that there is a cause and effect. And one of those things I preach and talk to my clients about is that there's always a cause and effect when it comes to physiology in the brain. Sometimes it's difficult to find that cause, but in this case, the cause is pretty obvious. It's a big elephant in the room. But I didn't understand the link, the really systematic, holistic link. No one had ever, to my ignorance as even as an exercise physiologist, no one had ever conclusively explained to me the vagus nerve, stomach, right, the SA node link. No one had ever explained to that, and why do we belly breathe and how do you do it? Don't just say, hey, take deep breaths and relax. Finally, someone gave me, in the same context of the community that I spent hundreds of thousands of hours, if you want to say that, really, not literally, but learning how to, the tactics, for example, right? That's very obvious and clear how you take an individual that's capable and teach them how to do an actual hostage rescue. It's really easy for me, right? It makes sense. It's that process. Someone finally laid out a process to me that says, you're experiencing these physical manifestations of stress. Here's why. No one had ever bridged that gap for me. And for somebody, the vast majority of my community are outliers. You asked the question, how? Because I am under extreme stress, right? In an actual real-world hostage rescue, my heart rate is 86, right? 86 beats per minute. That's what I averaged in combat.
That's your heart on stress.
Yep. So I get very parasympathetic in high stress. Appropriately parasympathetic. And I can, this is gonna sound really weird, but I can smell fear. When I would go into an actual combat scenario, I could see somebody smell under a door. I could see it.
You had a visual sense of it.
I could literally see.
What color is it?
It was green. I could see it under doors, so I could say, that's the bad person. And I would go to the door, and every single time I was right. And so you get these weird sort of senses about it, and I was good at it. I was really good at my job. So, my point is that if you take, and we've done that, and that was one of John's inner workings with the community. I'm not special amongst that community. We're all like that. And that community tends to find those individuals, and you take those individuals and you put them in the most extreme environment, and it's easy. It's really easy. It was really easy. And it's funny, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the original Aliens trilogy, right? There's a point in one of the Aliens movies where he's actually the guy that played Michael Bain. He played the Navy SEAL in the movie Navy SEAL Charlie Sheen. He's sleeping on the way in, onto that planet. And if every single time without fail, all of us would get on this 47 Chinook, the helicopter, in real world combat, and within 3 to 5 minutes, we'd all be asleep. That's the only time I ever slept. I had this total parasympathetic, sympathetic shift in the point of greatest need, because my body knew what was going to encounter on target. So now this is all the stuff that John is laying out for me, and I'm like, that makes amazing sense. Why is nobody telling us this? Because people in sport all over the world are getting this information. Why are the greatest consumers in the world, our military and law enforcement, not getting the information? And I have my own reasons for that, but why we're not.
Let me ask John. Why do you think?
I think some of it, I think it's multi-layered. I think it's multi-layered, some of it. I think some of it has to do with cultural. I spoke about this earlier. I think we're really embedded in our culture of wanting to believe desperately that high performance comes down to a single factor. Words like toughness, words like grit, words like mindset. But no process of high performance comes down to a single factor. And all sport has a history of coming from the military as a way to teach tactics. So they have fed each other in this false narrative. But it took the military first to understand, wait a minute, everyone goes home after a football game and a soccer game, unless you're Colombian, or a gymnastics meet, or a swim meet. So we have to be more specific than using catch-all terms that have no science. So they've been really the first to shift in a more earnest way. Sport does it in a way of just being competitive advantage. They're doing it because it has a higher meaning. But I think it's really cultural ethos, because we want to desperately believe in that Hollywood kind of concept, as opposed to we know that all of us in the room are performers. Think about the things you love to do. There's not one single thing that drives that process to an outcome that you desire. It really is multifactorial, and it's individually based. And so we want easy answers to complex problems. And that's why also I think people lean away from the brain. Yet that holds a lot of the answers to many of the processes we have questions about.
I forgot to mention, we should have time for some questions in a few minutes, so you might be thinking of what you want to ask these guys. And at the risk of picking one factor as the explanation for everything, I do want to explore something you mentioned in passing, sleep.
I was going to say, that's the answer. Like, at the end of the day, that's the answer for it. It sounds, maybe not to this group, that's the answer.
First tell me, when you couldn't sleep, was it just because your schedule was too crazy? Or because even if you had time that was not otherwise scheduled, you couldn't put your...
It was a lot of things. And so we have devalued, for all of us that are parents in the room, I don't mean to pose a question to answer another one, kind of. And I'm not looking for participation or anything like that, but...
Take that.
For those of us that are that are parents, or we've spent any time in a pediatric wing of a hospital, what are we really, really vigilant about? Noise control, light control, temperature control. What are they sleeping in? And unfortunately, we can't reproduce colostrum, so casein protein. There's a whole sort of mixture of what, as parents, we're very vigilant about in our lifestyles for our young developing brains. Okay? And because they're fragile, and they are, but so very powerful. When you take an individual, an adult that's under those high stress conditions, we have devalued by nature of our extreme work life or life in general, and all that stuff starts falling away, right? That bedtime routine is something that becomes a source of stress rather than something that we have to do instead of something that we just need to do. And so for me, in that lifestyle, my life was a little bit chaotic, but I never really made the connection of the importance of, again, the correlation is, when I prepared to go do my job, it was precise, and it without measure, I didn't take shortcuts. Sleep was just something that you just had to do every so often. I devalued the importance of it because no one ever explained to me from a hormonal point, how powerful REM is and what happens during REM sleep, and when, all of those. That's kind of what I preach. I dumb it way down, but I say to people, I said, hey, if you're only getting REM sleep 3 times a night, you might only get it for an average of 9 minutes, and in those 9 minutes, the vast majority of the necessary hormones to heal the brain is in that REM sleep, or in the course of slumber, right? And I didn't realize that, if you're taking any spectrum of pain medication or Lunesta and Ambien and all these sort of things, that I'm not going to get into this state to heal my brain that I need to, and we become dependent on those sort of things. I don't drink, I never have, but I had other vices, specifically opiates. And so it's like, in the effort of trying to do the right thing to get to sleep, I'm actually, over a long course of time, prohibiting myself, or I am depleting myself of the necessary hormones to heal myself. So after I did blood work after blood work, for example, one of the markers, for example, because I know there's probably a number of medical doctors here in the room, my testosterone was at 16 nanograms per milliliter, 0.16, okay? And at the time I was 28. So
That's low.
my sella was damaged from my pituitary gland, and all my hormones are a mess. They have been for a long time. So at the one time I was under 17 medications prescribed, 17. That's what I was taking, and one was to counteract the other. And I was getting good medical care, but you trusted that, you think that, and that's where it all started with John. And I flew to Australia, met with Shona Howson, who is brilliant. She's the director of sleep and recovery for the Australian Institute of Sport. I did all my sleep work with her, and I traveled to all these places with people that I found out they give a damn. And moreover, they had encountered a lot of these symptomatic sort of things in sport. And so all I was doing was just pulling information going, wait a minute, I can solve this by not taking this, but by doing this. I can solve this by doing this and not taking this. And now I'm on one prescription medication. I take 200 milligrams of testosterone once a week. That's it. Whereas before it was trazodone and all this nonsense, So, but again, long story short is that what I discovered is that, to the point where I basically had to relearn to walk. I couldn't walk. My hair was falling out, my teeth, my fingernails. I hadn't had an erection in over 5 years, and I'm in my 20s. It got to my breaking point was that, my son means everything to me, and I didn't want to play with him. And that was about the time I met John. I almost didn't make the trip to see John. I get a little bit verklempt about it because of what I feel for my son, but to this day, he's 10 now, he's not so little, but I almost didn't make the trip because I was tucking my son in and I collapsed in his room, and he's the one that had to call the ambulance because I couldn't move. I have had total paralysis on the left side of my body. I had complete nervous system shutdown, and it got to the point where I was like, this is who I am, and this is what I have to deal with, and he's the one that has to go get my medication, and I just got to the point where that was my rock bottom. I was at
imagine.
Total rock bottom.
But John, I don't see how you look at this complex of issues. And I'm not trying to get you to speak personally about Jeff's situation, but just in general, how do you how do you figure out what to address first? I mean, ideally, none of the behaviors or practices that contributed to this would be happening, but they are. Yeah. And how do you deal with that? How do you sort out what the brain needs first?
First of all, you do have to do a good assessment. And I think often in our healthcare system, it fails us because we have great practitioners who want to do that, but they're not given the time on task to do that. And so you have to look at that, our system, because a bad system will break a good practitioner anytime. We all been there. Might be still there. But that system has to change. But when you look at just brain health, right, if it took a lot for us to be resilient, we actually wouldn't be around. We wouldn't have survived. And so we're overlooking how often do we sit with people when we don't evaluate sleep. We don't even ask about it. And that's the foundation of chefs. And neurologically that is. And napping as well. We're actually more wired for napping because it's a tighter window of what's needed than sleep. But then looking at hydration. That changes our neurological patterns. And if you look at how much caffeine we ingest or stimulants in the United States currently, it's incredibly high. And then we look at athletic populations that I work with, it's even higher. And then we look at, certainly law enforcement, military, and firefighters, even higher still, because of the amount of hours they're asked to do that. So that disrupts mood, concentration, focus over long term, disrupting neuroplasticity. And then you're looking at, again, we forget those, just mentioning hydration and food, they serve the brain. But like Jeff talked about, we just think about it as, just something I do. If we do not get in certain nutrition, map to what our needs are. Neurotransmitters will not get here, and there's more neurology here than here. And there has to be a pathway for it to get. This does not change to bringing neurotransmission and neural communication properly. Starting with basics, but we don't even start there. And most nutritional programs that are set up now are dealing with data that has nothing to do with the gut biome of what we've known in the last 5 or 6 years. And so these are interventions that are low-hanging fruit that we're not going for, that we're not educating, that we're not instituting at even young ages. And so it's starting at that place. In concussion work, that's my immediate place. Number one prognosis of how quickly they will recover from a concussion is their sleep patterns and health prior to the concussion and stabilizing it post. Otherwise, the tau proteins cannot, and they can't flush, and then we can't get neuroplasticity and growth cells in the brain to predominate. And so it's starting with basics. The science is there, it's really clear, but we're ignoring it even in complex cases. We know now that even when we look at severe, I don't like the term mental health because I don't think it serves us very well. It's not honest scientifically, it's really brain health. But when we look at schizophrenia, what are some of the earliest indicators? Sleep problems. And that leads us to stabilizing sleep, stabilizing activities of daily living, leads to a better prognosis, and we're seeing that in the literature more and more.
I hear you describe this, and part of it is that you have this incredibly calm delivery, but it sounds as if you're just going to change a few things and the brain's going to get back on track. There must be times when there are hang-ups. There must be times when
For sure, that's human
work.
variation. Yes, and then you do more assessment, and that's ecological in real time, and I think science has been slow to do that and slow to accept that. The technology allows us in real time, ecologically in the real environment, to evaluate strengths and changes in brain health. And you bring that data in. And that provides us even more richness. And we're not doing that. For instance, I only know 2 clinics in the United States currently that when you give a prescription to someone with a concussion and you describe to them what reducing and resting activity is, we know athletes and we know human beings that will go back to their default. I give them an actiograph. I give them where I can see their activity patterns. So when they come back, you're walking 10,000 steps a day. We asked you to rest. So let's talk about how to reformat that. And then we look at their HRV. It's not matching getting into a parasympathetic state of being restful. If what gets measured gets managed, and we're not managing and we're not measuring, because that leads to better answers. But it also leads to informing our patients of understanding their own biofeedback. It makes them more resilient because they're like, okay, that's what that means when I feel that signal or when I experience that upon waking. And so it's an information process that we should be not leaving out the patient, but we need to be better informed. An hour visit with anyone, without neurometrics and subjective information, it is tough to figure out, but you have to go deeper dive.
I have another question I want each of you to address, but we have time for some questions from the floor. Does anybody want to jump into this conversation? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can you
hear me now?
Sort of.
I spent 38 years in academia as a physician and worked as an immunologist and a consultant to try, with a group of us, to say, right now a military commander is reprimanded or relieved if he does not adequately hydrate his troops, and dehydration and hyperthermia sets in. There's a large advocacy to say that sleep should be considered like hydration. There is data from Vietnam where people ignored it, had healthcare teams operate 72 hours straight, and after that they were no longer functional. There was a 1976 New England Journal article that showed everybody becomes psychotic, right, if you're 72 hours sleep deprivation and on. So that data has been around forever. I teach at a medical school. We have a sleep module. I always ask, who of you here thinks sleep is a waste of time? More than 50% of the medical students think sleep is a waste of time. These are the people who are going to see the patients. We have a huge cultural barrier to understanding that sleep is as important as water and food. And actually as important as water because you need it even more. You know, you can dehydrate for a while, sleep, it doesn't work. Getting that through has been it's been one of my sorrows. And in immunology, we know what sleep deprivation does in terms of inflammation and of drivers. So, you know, we can't depend on this, what I call mystical primary care person who really doesn't exist and people are burning out because they can't provide the care they really want to.
Yeah.
We need to change the culture. How do we change the culture?
Well,
Beyond for the athletes?
How do we change the culture? Thank you.
I appreciate the question. I also appreciate your efforts. You're part of that. And I actually have worked with surgical teams on this sort of thing. And there was a time when I worked with surgical teams where I couldn't use the F word. No, not that one. Fatigue. I was actually not allowed to use that term because they were gods. They never suffered from it, they never experienced it, and it never happened. Yet, when we look at most seminal mistakes that happen in surgery, they're all human error, and they're due to fatigue. And so we had to term it differently. We had to call it underperformance, because that's what it was. But I think it goes back to this piece you're doing, and I teach at a medical school too, and I teach primary care physicians and then some orthopedic surgeons. And so you have to discuss it in ways to meet them where they're at. I use sport as the metaphor, because we look to athletes. I use military as a metaphor as well, because it plays into that ethos of toughness. But then I redirect them to what it really is scientifically. But I think another thing is we're not teaching this to kids in school. We're actually going against all the research. So Finland used to be one step ahead of us in science and math. We ranked 37th in the world. They used to rank 36th. In 5 years, they're number one now. Why? They use all their research that we do and actually apply it. Their days are 4 hours long. They allow for normal activities. They start later. You know, they start at 10 a.m., so it allows for a normal sleep schedule. So I think it's instituting a number of stakeholders and then building that up. Sport is a harder nut to crack, but it's an important one too. And we talk about it all the time. That sport is the mover in our culture. Good, bad, or indifferent. I can argue both sides of that. The very fact is if we don't get sport to understand that the brain matters, a lot of other parts of our culture won't. And it is a driver for it. And there are enclaves that are moving it. Because we've talked about it. We were talking about it earlier. No one cares about the brain until they need to care about it, and then they don't care about it again. And if you use mental health as a term, nobody cares. So you have to use performance and sport to drive it, but you have to touch a lot of stakeholders. So you're doing that work. Thank you.
I'm sure John and Jeff will hang around and answer questions. I want to just throw one quick one at them before we conclude this panel more or less on time, and that is, we've heard so much during Brain Futures of the explosion of possibilities, and yet your story of how hard it was for you to get to the help and the explanation you needed also reminds us that this is urgent to figure out how to connect people. So what message do you want people in this room to take away? What is the most important thing looking ahead to the challenge in front of us? What would either one of you or both of you say we need to do first and foremost?
I think it's a bit of a carryover from the statement and the question that's just still here, is that, and I spend, that's kind of on the other side, I spend a lot of time in professional athletics. I consult for a lot of different teams and organizations, and here's the underlying factor to so much, is that too much is assumed. And what I mean is, you know, especially professional athletes, even our military, it's often a one-way street, and we always wonder why we can't hold people accountable. It's because we haven't educated them. You can only hold people accountable when you've educated them. And at that point, you can hold their feet to the fire. You know, I'm really well known for being quite choosy on my words, and maybe it's just by the nature of who I am or whatever. But you know, there is in my community is just as guilty. The sports community is very guilty. No one wants to take any responsibility, and that is easy. So like the question about the hydration thing, why that's happening is because nobody's teaching it at the military level. That's why. And if it's not being taught, people go, I didn't know. And if you don't know, you can't hold anyone accountable. And it's unfortunate that the people at the bottom and the top can't be teaching the same thing. So, I think that that's the big thing is, we're probably all practitioners and we're all educators here. And that's the only way I've ever seen sustainability, and that's through education. And that is why I think it's so important that John and I are able to show you all that there is an impact to be had and you guys are all doing it. It just kind of sucks that it takes someone like me to get the shit blown out of them for 11 years to see that what you all are doing is really valuable. And I will say this, is that there is a certain level of ignorance that exists historically because, in the military, and I'm not picking on the military, I'm critical of it. I love my country and military more than anything other than my son. But it is cultural, and it's a big nut to crack because our military and sport does everything internally out. And because it has to be self-sustaining. So education has to be there. And this is the last statement I'll say, is that the beauty of our military in terms of the context of learning these things, so many of them, as opposed to sport, the shortfall in sport is, to be quite frank, most of those athletes are dumber than a sack of hammers. And they're spoiled, and they're unappreciative, and they've always been told they're great. Whereas our military and law enforcement and fire, it doesn't matter. They'll take a bullet, right? They'll go into that burning building, and when you say, you have these issues, this litmus of issues, and we can help you, they are all ears. And unfortunately, pharmaceuticals and the business of our veterans has been a way to make money. And I'm all for capitalism, but I'm all for education.
John, last word? Short last word?
Short last word. Wow, I'm Irish. That's tough. What I would say is, like Jeff said, everyone in here has a place in this. And we've heard this a lot in other political terms of late, is speaking truth to power, but more importantly, well-packaged truth. Because people are intimidated by the brains. We have to meet them where they're at. And everyone has a role in that here. And that's part of, I think, leaving here and to continue to propagate teaching, educating, but truth and well-packaged truth. So we make these changes.
Thank you both. John Sullivan, Jeff Nichols.
Good talk.
Good talk. Good talk.
So I want to thank the three of you, and I want to thank all of you for being here in the last day and a half. I think about where we started, some really complex medical situations, some miraculous recoveries with new innovations that 5 years ago none of us would have dreamed of. And here we have a personal story, an equally complex medical situation, and frankly some pretty simple whole health solutions, at least in this country where we have plentiful supply of water, but don't think about how fundamentally it impacts our health. So I hope for all of you, the conference has been food for thought. I hope, whatever your vantage point, you've gained things that you can use in your own life, in your work, those you care about, and I hope you'll be back for the next Brain Futures. Thank you all.